Hi, I'm Rita and this is Sarah, and we are speech and language therapy students on placement. So today we're going to be introducing you to Gestalt Language Processing, and you might be wondering why that is, and that's because there's growing evidence that a significant number of autistic children are learning language through Gestalt Language Processing. So it's important to know about it when you're working with autistic people. We've also got a survey which you can complete before and after the presentation if you'd like. It's just on that top right corner. It's just to gauge how informed people are on the topic beforehand and whether watching the presentation has been helpful in developing your knowledge. It's very short, it'll only take you a minute or so, and it's anonymous too. There's a hyperlink at the end of the slides if you'd rather use that than the QR code.
So just to show you what's coming up in this presentation. So first of all, we're going to talk about the traditional view of how children learn language before explaining what Gestalt language processing is and how it's different. And we're going to be using the acronym GLP throughout to refer to either Gestalt language processing or Gestalt language processors, because that's a bit of a mouthful. And then we're going to give some very brief information on the history of this approach and touch on the different stages that Gestalt language processors go through with some video examples. After that, we're going to present some of the limitations of this approach and what to bear in mind when researching it, before talking about why this topic is so important to consider and how you might incorporate it into your work. At the end of the presentation, we'll link to lots of resources if you want to learn more or share information with parents. So first of all, we're going to start with analytical language processing. So this is the most common method of learning language that we think of, and it's actually the only language process that SLTs are taught about in training at the moment. So we just assume that everyone learns language this way. So an analytical language processor will learn single words at a time and their meanings, and then over time they start to put 2 or 3 words together to make phrases. For example, starting with milk, then want milk, then me want milk, and then I want milk. And just to say, in this presentation, we're using cogs to symbolize words so you can visualize the different ways that language develops. So if you keep this traditional view in mind, now we're going to talk about how Gestalt language processing differs from the analytical model.
So to start off with Gestalt language processing, it's important to just clarify a few different definitions. So the first one is echolalia. So traditionally, echolalia is a part of the DSM-5 criteria, but we're not going to be thinking about it in that context throughout this presentation. Instead, we're just going to be thinking about it in its simplest form, which is that echolalia is repeating words or phrases exactly as you've heard them. So that might be with the same intonation or without the same intonation. There are 2 types of echolalia. You've got immediate echolalia, which is when you repeat a word or a phrase right after you've heard it or after a very brief delay, and delayed echolalia, which is when you repeat a word or a phrase quite some time after you've heard it. The phrases and words used in delayed echolalia can also be called gestalts. So a gestalt is essentially a chunk of language which carries one individual meaning to the person using it. So it might be 2 words, 3 words, or much more than that. It might even be several sentences. It might be helpful to think about the definition of Gestalt in psychology, which is that a Gestalt processor is somebody who processes information as a whole rather than the sum of each part. So the information as a whole actually tells you more than looking at each part individually. Another key definition to know is scripting. So we can think of scripting as delayed echolalia, or you can think of it as pre-planned or pre-rehearsed phrases or sentences. So an example when you might use scripting is if you're memorizing answers for an interview. It's relevant here because there are a lot of accounts of autistic children using scripts from TV shows or movies, and we can think of it as a part of Gestalt language processing and a type of delayed echolalia. So to go over Gestalt language processing now, it is essentially when you learn language in chunks or gestalts instead of single words. So as I said before, a child who's using gestalts each of those gestalts has one individual meaning to that child, regardless of how many words is in that gestalt. So you can see it here in the cogs. So each of these cogs is a gestalt, but they all have a different number of words, and they all have one meaning to that child. I'm now going to show you a good example from the speech and language therapist Boho Speechy on Instagram, who described one of her clients who was using a gestalt, and she wasn't sure exactly what it meant, and neither were the child's parents. The gestalt was, it was honey, honey, like that. And the child was using it whenever she was upset or hurt, but they weren't really sure kind of whether that's exactly what it meant or what she was using it for. But later on, the child's mum heard this song from Cocomelon when her child was watching it on TV. And I'll just play it for you now.
Ow! Honey, honey.
Yes, my dear.
So you can see in that video that after that character was hurt, he sang honey, honey. So that child had associated that phrase with being hurt or upset, and that's why she was using it. So it's quite classic of Gestalt language processors, as in Gestalts are often learned from phrases or speech that's really, really rich in intonation. So that might be from songs, from TV shows, from YouTube videos, and they're often, but not always, repeated in the same intonation. So in this case, the child was repeating it in that same kind of sing-song intonation as in the video. So just overall, this image from an SLT's website just kind of describes the key differences between analytical language processing and Gestalt language processing. And I'd just like to make clear a few really key implications of these differences. So the first one is that the meaning of Gestalts and the intent of the language that a child is using can often be much less clear when that child is using Gestalts. So you really need to know where that Gestalt has been learned from or what it was associated with to understand it. In contrast, children who are using analytical language processing, because they're starting off with shorter phrases, it's often much clearer what their meaning is. Another key implication to think about is that it can be a lot harder to work out how much a Gestalt language processor is actually understanding from language. Their expressive language might not match their understanding of language. So, for example, if they're in quite early stages of a Gestalt language processing, they'll be using phrases that actually have quite complex grammar because that's how they've been learned. They've learned them like word for word. But actually, that child might not understand a lot of that complex grammar. And it can go the other way around when that child is in the later stages of Gestalt language processing, which we'll touch on in a few slides' time. Another important thing to think about is who actually uses analytical language processing or Gestalt language processing. So we've already said that there are lots of accounts of autistic children using echolalia, and Gestalt language processing seems to make sense for quite a lot of autistic children. One of the key theorists suggested that some people who mostly use analytic language processing might also use Gestalt language processing, but it doesn't necessarily go the other way around. And in the case of a child who's appearing to use Gestalt language processing, it might be really difficult to figure out whether they're using analytic language processing as well. And in fact, you know, if you know that they're using GLP, then using ALP strategies and techniques might not support that child and their language development. So that's important to consider too.
So this is just to give some background to this research area. So the term Gestalt language processing was first used by Dr. Anne Peters, who is a clinical linguist, to describe a number of very young children that she noticed using multi-word chunks in their early language. And she published a book on the topic in the 80s, which is fully available as a PDF via the link on the slide if you're interested. And this idea was extended by Dr. Barry Prisant. He's an SLT and autism researcher, so you might have heard of him because he's one of the people behind the CERTS model of intervention. And he published a paper in 1983 which proposed 4 different stages of Gestalt language acquisition, and we're going to come on to those in a few slides' time. But obviously this was all going on in the 80s, which is now quite a while ago, but it's really picked up more recently, and that's partly due to the work of Dr. Marge Blanc, who is an SLT. And she published a book fleshing out the 4 stages of Gestalt language acquisition and adding 2 more. And she described these as part of a natural language acquisition framework, or NLA. So you might see both terms used if you're doing your own research. She and her team have 2 really great websites, which are very accessible, and we will link to at the end of the slides if you want to read more. She's also done lots of podcast interviews and webinars, and she's published a language sampling protocol to assess which stage a child is at, especially for the later stages when they're beginning to develop more complex grammar.
So in terms of the stages of Gestalt language processing, so after a child has acquired a Gestalt from their environment that they've heard, they then start mitigating them. And mitigation is basically just breaking down parts of the Gestalts and combining them. So I'll give you an example to help you make sense of it a little bit clearer. So a child might have learned the Gestalt, let's go for a drive. And then they might have also learned another Gestalt, which is we're going on a bear hunt. And over time, as they progress through the stages of GLP, they'll eventually be able to take parts of different Gestalts and combine them to make new Gestalts with new meanings. So for example, it might turn into, let's go for a bear hunt. And this is how Gestalt language processors develop flexible language. So they start to isolate parts of Gestalt. So at the start, that might be the first part of the Gestalt or the ending. And in the most advanced stages of GLP, that's isolating single words from Gestalts. So these are the GLP stages in more detail. I'm not going to go over them now, but you're welcome to come back and have a look at them at the end of the presentation. And this is just kind of a summary of GLP stages and also some examples of how a child using this model of language processing will develop advanced grammar and flexible language over time.
So we've given you a bit of an idea about what stages a Gestalt language processor might go through, but what does that actually look like in the real world? So we've now got some videos of stages 1 to 3 from the Meaningful Speech Instagram account. So we're going to play all of these now in this recording, and hopefully the audio and everything works for you. But feel free to skip ahead if you're short on time. We've got the links to the videos in the slides if you want to come back to them at a later date. So this first video is a child in stage 1, and you're probably going to hear the child produce a fairly unintelligible string with musical intonation. Maybe that's something that you would describe as jargon. So we're going to let the beginning of this play twice. So if you read the text on screen, then see if you can tune into the Gestalt the second time around and work out what the child might be saying.
Bumped his head. Let's go again. Let's go yellow ball.
So that was a child in stage 1. And now we're going to show you a video of a child in stage 2. So this is the mitigation that Rita was talking about earlier. In this video of a child, you'll hear them take a longer Gestalt, which is make a circle, and they're beginning to swap out the final word to create new combinations. So the practitioners, it's an OT and an SLT, are acknowledging his communication and then modelling task-relevant language like colours and shapes.
Let's make it together. Make a circle. Purple. Perfect.
Make an oval.
Let's make an oval. There we go. See you later, Pink.
Ooh, I got it.
Make
A green.
make a rectangle.
A rectangle.
Make a rectangle.
Okay, it goes 1, 2, 3.
So that was a child in stage 2. And then this final video that we've got is a child in stage 3. So this is when children start freeing single words from larger gestalts. So you'll hear the child using single words and trying out new 2-word combinations. And the practitioner is matching that language level and modelling different 2-word combinations. And this is something that advocates of GLP are really hot on, is if a child gets to the single word level, don't try and push them too far to expand their sentences, but really encourage them to sort of play around with language and different shorter word combinations, which hopefully you'll hear in this video.
Triangles. Little triangles.
Seat.
Seat?
Or
Ooh, car seat.
car seat.
Yeah, triangle seat.
Uh-oh.
Blue triangle? Oh, red triangle. Oh, more triangles. Triangle down.
Triangle off.
Triangle off.
Whoopsie.
Triangle in.
There, there you go.
Yeah.
That's better.
Yeah.
So hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour of what types of children we might be talking about here and what their communication might look like at different stages. At this point, we just wanted to talk about some of the limitations of this model. And many of these ideas come from the Informed SLP article, which is linked on the slides. We are aware that not all of these points are accepted by SLTs who work within GLP. It's a bit more of a critical viewpoint, but we thought it was important to present a balanced view for you. So the first thing to consider is whether echolalia is always communicative. So Marge Blanc's NLA theory says yes, but not everyone agrees. It could be a form of stimming, and some people think it might be, in some cases, where children are echoing language not to communicate, but because they enjoy the sensation of producing or hearing the words. In practice, it's really difficult to tell, especially at the early stages. So from the research that we've done, the best advice seems to be to acknowledge all echolalia as if it is communicative. The next thing is, how do you actually know if a child is a Gestalt language processor? So NLA practitioners suggest that this applies to many autistic children, but critics say that there is no official data. So some people, as Rita was saying before, some people say that it's a continuum and that many people do a bit of both. So the example that was given in the SLP, Informed SLP article is that maybe you've had this experience learning a foreign language where you've picked up a chunk of language and you'd be able to recite that chunk, but you don't actually know how to break it down into separate words. So the example that they gave was the song, or the line, Voulez-vous coucher avec moi, from the song Lady Marmalade. Perhaps you've had an experience with something like that where you've been able to recite a phrase like that, but you actually don't know where the different word boundaries are, and you wouldn't be able to use the language from that phrase to construct a new phrase. So that's the argument that people do a bit of both, although that is something that's contentious within GLP practitioners. The only way really to know is through language sampling. And so in a clinic context, the best thing that you can do is really just to listen to the child to get a better understanding of their communication. And the final point here is thinking about where the evidence for this approach comes from. So researchers like Anne Peters and Marge Blanc used in-depth case studies to derive the stages of GLP and create some principles for intervention. But because they were case studies, that means that they don't have any control groups to compare against. And at the moment, we don't really have much research evidence that supports a more Gestalt-tailored therapy approach over a traditional therapy approach for these children. However, research evidence is only part of evidence-based practice. This is something that the Informed SLP article discusses really nicely. And so this approach does much better in the categories of clinical expertise and patient values. So we're going to touch on this more next, and you can also go to the article if you want to read more.
So following on from that slide, we're just going to have a think about why is GLP important? So the first thing is that GLP shows us that echolalia is communicative. Historically, echolalia has been seen as meaningless, and behavioural interventions have been used with autistic people to try and stop them from using echolalia. But through GLP, we know that actually each gestalt has a unique meaning to the person that's using it, and each gestalt is communicating something, even if it's not always clear to other people. It's also really important because it validates a lot of personal accounts. So accounts of parents and therapists who notice patterns of when a gestalt was used and for what communicative purpose with their children or the children that they were working with. And it also validates first-person accounts of autistic adults who use echolalia and scripting. The last thing to think about is that GLP also provides us with a possible explanation for jargon. So we know that a lot of young autistic children use jargon. And if you're not sure what jargon is, it's basically long strings of sounds that sound like speech and usually have the intonation of speech, but they're not intelligible, and it's often really unclear what that child is saying. So those long strings of speech sounds might actually be scripts when you're looking through the lens of GLP. So that young child who's using those scripts might not have learned to produce a lot of speech sounds because of their age. So actually that jargon might be them scripting, but it's really unintelligible because of their immature speech sounds. So the second thing to think about is presuming competence. What if we assumed each child is capable of thinking, learning, and understanding beyond what they're showing you in the present moment? So GLP shows us that echolalia is communicative. So we can presume that that child has competence in communicating. Even if we're not sure of what that communicative intent is, it's really important to acknowledge it and presume competence unless it's clear that they're not communicating. It's also really important to think about the fact that their expressive language, the language that they're using, might not reflect their understanding of language, as I mentioned earlier. So, for example, an individual who is in the later stages of GLP, they will have started extracting single words from gestalts and combining them into phrases. So their language might actually appear simpler than the language you'd expect from an analytic language processor at a similar age to them. And that might mean that you assume that their understanding of language is less developed than it actually is, because their expressive language might not necessarily match up to that. The next really important thing to think about is that GLP really aligns with the broader neurodiversity movement. So GLP shows us that echolalia is a normal variation in how people learn language, and it's likely that a lot more people use it than we know. It helps us to acknowledge the communication strengths of autistic children and individuals and recognize that this process of learning language is different, it's not deficient. It also broadens our understanding of autistic people in general, and it reinforces that autistic cognition and communication is valid and doesn't need fixing.
So whilst we're on this topic, we just wanted to sort of pose a question to you for your own reflection. So do current interventions work for GLP learners? So if a significant number of autistic children do use Gestalt language processing, then are current interventions, maybe PECS is a good example, supporting their unique language development? So some things to think about are which environments provide opportunities for children to learn meaningful or emotionally charged language within contexts that they understand. And also, we want to support autistic children to share joy, to comment, to ask questions, to self-advocate. So consider which interventions support children to communicate for many different purposes. And then finally here, to develop flexible language which can be adapted for lots of different situations and emotions, GLP learners need to combine different parts of their gestalts with increasing complexity. So think about which tools will support them to do this. And if you want to reflect on some of these questions, we've got a link on the slide to a sort of take on using PECS with Gestalt language processors, and also about AAC and Gestalt language processing. So as we come towards the end of this presentation, just going to talk now about how you can use what you hopefully now know about Gestalt language processing in your work. So lots of these things you will already be thinking about and doing. Just wanted to sort of bring it all together here and say that with GLP learners, you might need to delve a bit deeper and spend a bit more time building trust and rapport. So firstly, you could ask parents and carers about patterns that they've noticed when a child is using a specific phrase or using echolalia or echoed language. Another really important thing that you can do is just to listen extra closely to the child's language. And maybe you could make a note of the context of a Gestalt, if you think they might be a Gestalt language processor, and what you think that child might be trying to communicate. Another really important thing is to affirm and acknowledge Gestalts to help build trust. So this could be as simple as just going, yeah, just showing them that you've heard what they've said, or it could be that you imitate the Gestalts, or perhaps you repeat the Gestalt, you repeat the phrase, but you change it slightly and see what the child does in response. And this is something that we thought could apply to the new clinic model. So perhaps some of the strategies that you're trialing could involve modifying your reaction to Gestalts and seeing what the child's response is. And just on this topic, I'm not going to read these in details, but just to show that respecting and acknowledging children as Gestalt language processors also aligns with professional guidance. So here are some guidelines from the RCOT, the BPS and the RCSLT, in case you want to revisit these later.
So we have some resources for further reading and information if you'd like to read a little bit more. Some of these we've mentioned already, and some of these are just extra things that you can have a look at. We've also got a few podcast episodes. There's quite a few SLT podcasts out there and quite a few that talk specifically about Gestalt language processing. And lastly, here is a slide of some resources that might be helpful to share with parents or carers on Gestalt language processing. The information in these resources is kind of a little bit easier to read for people who aren't speech and language therapists, so it might be a little bit more accessible. So thank you for listening. We hope that you've learned something new from our presentation. We do have the survey. If you'd like to complete it, it would be helpful for us to get a bit of feedback for future presentations. So the QR code is there and the link is there too. Okay, goodbye.